right, so I think we got a good amount of folks here, so I think we can go ahead and get started. My name is Jenny Glass. I'm the Director of Advocacy for the ACLU of Virginia, and I've been there for close to a little over 2 years now. And what I do for the ACLU of Virginia is oversee the legislative program with our legislative director, work on a couple of different projects related to criminal legal reform and voting rights. I wanted to start by just saying, we're really excited to be able to share a lot of information with you and make sure that you know what you need to know for voting in this pandemic. We've worked with voting rights and in the voting rights area for a really long time, but the last 6 weeks have been, really, really strange. And we've had to pivot quite a bit, as has the national ACLU, to really respond to a variety of problems that have popped up in the way that COVID-19 has impacted elections and the way that we think about voting. Today, we're going to talk with a national expert from the national ACLU, Bobby Hoffman, who's going to join us. I'm Vishal Agraharkar, who's a senior staff attorney at the ACLU of Virginia, who's working on some litigation that hopefully will help ease and loosen some of these restrictive issues we found as COVID-19 has had its impact on our voting system. We're also just going to explain kind of what we think Virginia should be doing to make voting more accessible during this time period and respond to the issues that are popping up from the pandemic. And hopefully you walk away with understanding how to vote absentee and how to apply for an absentee ballot for a local election, if that's something that you have in where you're from, but also for the June primary as well. So we'll walk through that at the end. We're also going to talk about maintaining in-person voting as well, but we do want to make sure that you understand how to get out and vote in the next upcoming election. So we'll go ahead and get started by looking at sort of a 20,000-foot view of voting rights in the landscape across the country. So we're joined by Bobby Hoffman. He's the Deputy Director for the Voting Rights Division at our national ACLU. He's been doing voting rights work for a really long time, election protection, and has a lot of experience just looking across the scope of voting rights reform and all the different ways to make voting more accessible. So Bobby, what is happening with COVID-19? How has it been? What are you seeing from a larger view of what's going on in the country with voting rights and the issues that are popping up?
Thanks, Jenny. First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here, and I love any opportunity to talk about voting rights in Virginia because I have a past working on election protection issues there, and I currently now live, as of a week ago, in Herndon, Virginia. So I'm now a new resident and soon-to-be voter in Virginia. So the impact of COVID on elections, like we are seeing in many aspects of life, COVID has had an incredible impact on both the administration of elections and how individuals are casting their ballots. I think what we saw in Wisconsin was an incredible impact on the way in which elections were administered there. What we saw in Wisconsin for the primary election was a huge shift in how people cast their ballots. Traditionally in Wisconsin elections, you see a very small amount of individuals cast absentee ballots and ballots by mail. Traditionally, that number has been in the single digits. For this election, it was 70% of voters cast ballots by mail. Also, as an impact of COVID, we saw many individuals not show up to work as poll workers because of the impact of COVID, and because of that, a shrinking of polling locations. One concern here is that the individuals that often serve as poll workers are also overlapped with those who are most impacted by COVID. The average age of a poll worker in the United States is 61 years old. And obviously we know now that elderly individuals are more likely to be susceptible to COVID, and due to those concerns, many folks were not showing up to act as poll workers. So we saw a decrease in polling locations for Election Day. This was most evident in Milwaukee, where traditionally there are nearly 200 polling locations, where on election day it was 5 or 6, I believe.
Mm.
I think one impact of that was incredibly long lines, and because of those long lines, lower turnout. So in Milwaukee, I think it's a little bit hard to judge turnout from this election to the previous presidential primary because of there not being a competitive Republican primary for the presidential election. But we saw roughly a 30% decrease in turnout in Milwaukee, which is a big issue to flag. So coming out of the election in Wisconsin, I think we can see what issues are going to be possibilities for the November election. We're seeing that more people are going to be voting by mail. Because of that, our election administrators need to be ready to count and process those the absentee ballot requests and count the ballots once they come in. We're going to see a need for recruitment of poll workers, primarily from demographics that are less likely to be impacted by COVID. We're going to see probably some shrinkage in polling locations that are available on election day throughout the country. I think lastly, we're going to see that we're going to need a large amount of personal protective equipment for poll workers as they volunteer to work on election day and help ensure that all individuals have an opportunity to vote in person, which I know is something that you all are going to continue to work on as well in Virginia.
Yeah, you mentioned something about being ready to count ballots and verify ballots, and this is something that we've been looking at in Virginia. And I think just generally the COVID-19 has sort of highlighted a lot of gaps that were always there in a lot of our voting systems, our criminal legal system. But one of the gaps that is pretty glaring for us is having guidance or some kind of statewide uniformity to verifying and counting ballots. So just kind of nationally, do you think that with the surge that we're going to see in absentee ballots being maybe the primary method of voting, do you think that states are ready at this point to count? And if you have any idea of this, and you may not at all, but what are the rejection rates, or anything like that, as far as ballots and what that might have an impact on?
So we did some recent work on this issue in Florida. I think what is concerning is that in many localities within Florida, from county to county, they don't have the same criteria for counting absentee ballots and what that looks like. So we are working with the supervisors of elections, which are the county election administrators in Florida, to put in uniform guidance for all of their poll workers so that they are all working from the same set of requirements in order to reject an absentee ballot for a variety of reasons. But I think one really important issue nationwide to talk about here is notice and cure procedures when an individual's ballot is rejected. Ballots can be rejected for a variety of reasons in states. The most common are that individuals forget to sign their name when sending in the absentee ballot. But what is required of election administrators at that point throughout the country varies from state to state. Because so many individuals are going to be casting a ballot by mail this election, we think it's going to be really important that every state sort of opportunity for individuals to be notified if their ballot is not accepted, and be provided time to cure the issue. So if an election administrator decides that can't be counted because there's a missing signature or missing date, or maybe has a mismatched signature, we want to make sure that individuals are notified and have a timely manner to come in and cure any issues with their ballot and ensure that it's counted.
Are there places that you're seeing from persons that are doing this better are becoming more prepared, are getting, creating some solutions to the issues, because I think there's definitely trends of the same problems that exist in one state exist in another. Are there any states that we can kind of look at as a model at this point?
So I think, in terms of conducting an election that is going to be in large part by mail, there are certainly some states that are way ahead of the curve on this issue than others. Colorado is certainly one of those states. The way in which elections are conducted in Colorado is they have universal distribution of ballots. So every single registered voter is mailed a ballot before the election. And once the voter receives the ballot, they have a variety of options in order to cast that ballot. So they have the ability to return it by mail. They can drop it off at drop boxes within their county. They can cast it at an early voting location within their county, or on election day, they can turn it in to their local polling location. In addition to the opportunity to cast a ballot by mail for all registered voters, Colorado also has opportunities for individuals to cast a ballot who have not been registered yet. So if you haven't been registered, you could still register, cast a ballot at one of the early voting locations, or election day registration is available in that state so that individuals can still go in and cast a ballot. Additionally, Colorado has processes set in place that if your ballot is rejected for some reason, they have a process set in place where they notify the voters and they have an opportunity to cure. So I think particularly for the upcoming November election, as states are looking to conduct elections that are going to be much more geared towards mail ballots, the focus is looking more out west towards states like Colorado, Arizona, California, Washington, Oregon, Montana, where those states have conducted nearly all mail elections for some time and have a lot of these processes built in place through trial and error over years and of conducting these types of elections, that they've kind of built the processes necessary in order to conduct a smooth election.
Gotcha. That makes sense. I think that's a good segue to go into what needs to happen in Virginia. Just a couple of quick slides. I'm going to share my screen to talk through some things we think need to happen to make voting more accessible during this time period. Then we're going to be joined by Vishal, who is going to talk about our lawsuit that we have pending right now around one of the first things we're going to talk about that we think needs to change in Virginia to make sure that our voting is a lot more accessible. So bear with me while I share my screen really quickly. Cool. Vishal, maybe you can give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen. Great, thanks. Okay, so one of the, we want to make sure that we're making voting by mail easier. We've been talking a lot about vote by mail. And really, this comes down to a handful of things in Virginia. So Vishal is going to talk a lot more about this, but removing the witness requirement. 30% of people over the age of 65 in Virginia live alone. And we know from folks coming to us, telling us, hey, this is an issue for me. How am I supposed to fulfill this? Basically, in Virginia, we're one of a handful of states that still has a requirement that you must have a witness kind of watch you open, mark, and then seal your absentee ballot in order for it to not be challenged when you turn it in. This is a huge issue that we're seeing for folks that do live alone or are practicing safe social distancing, to people reaching out to us and saying, hey, I live in an apartment. I can go find someone here to help me do this, but I really don't want to. So Vishal will talk a lot more about that. But some other things that we think can be done and need to be done quickly. Actually, some of these things happened during our last General Assembly session. We just really needed them to be enacted sooner so that they could be available to folks for the May and the May local elections and the June election. So one of those is providing prepaid postage for returning ballots in the mail. This law was actually passed this year, and as of July 1 will go into effect that registrars have to provide prepaid postage for returning ballots. It just isn't going to be in effect until July 1. Loosening the requirements on who can drop off your absentee ballot, when they can do it, and under what circumstance. So right now, we do have some ability for a third party to drop off an absentee ballot, but actually this last General Assembly session, we broadened that even more so. So we'd love to see that go into effect earlier. We'd love to see that be in effect for the June primaries or for the May local elections. We also want to see extensions to the deadlines for returning ballots and the amount of time that election officials have to count, verify, and get in touch with voters. There's a lot of what Bobby was talking about with making sure that there's a cure, what's called a cure process. If you see a mistake on a ballot, what kind of methods are we using to actually reach out to folks and get that information from them so they can correct that in a timely fashion after the election and fix it so that their ballot can still be counted. We also want to allow everyone to apply for an application online to vote absentee. We'll go through at the end of the presentation here a little bit about how to apply for an absentee ballot. And one of those methods is online, but there's some restrictions on who can do that and who cannot. So we'd love to see that change. We also, as Bobby mentioned, we are advocating that in-person polling locations still be maintained to some degree for those who can't vote by mail, and that's for a few different reasons. Vishal might even talk a little bit about this too, why we feel strongly about this. But for those who cannot vote by mail, we feel like we need to preserve that, and we want to do that safely, abiding by CDC guidelines. Obviously, they are not going to look the same as they would have in a normal election, not under the circumstances of a pandemic. Like Bobby talked about, lot fewer polling locations, probably not staffed as well. But switching to a mail-only election could really severely impact turnout. That's not the only reason we want to preserve that, but it is, who that's impacting is our most vulnerable populations, Black and Brown communities, elderly people, and especially local elections where turnout is already pretty low. And so changing anything, making it more difficult to access the ballot box is going to decrease turnout. Studies also show that individuals with lower incomes and communities of color often have less reliable mail delivery service. We think that could potentially get exacerbated by the pandemic, and they're also less likely to have permanent addresses. So both things really affect the ability for the mailing process to be as easy for some folks as it is for others. And so we see some, unintentional disenfranchisement really possible there. Studies also show, and I think Bobby was alluding this to a little bit in Florida, but that the rate of rejection among mail ballots can really vary along lines of race. Seeing higher rejection rates in mail ballots among Black and Brown communities as opposed to white communities. So we want to make sure that we're not unintentionally disenfranchising anyone by converting to a system that maybe can't even handle the amount of participation that it's going to have. So we want to make sure we're maintaining some in-person polling precincts in Virginia. But we are going to move on to talking a little bit about one of the things we're doing to try to take action on that. So we'll move on to talking to Vishal. There's this lovely photo of him in a former reality where he used to go to our physical offices. So I'll break from my sharing of my screen at this point and talk to Vishal here. What is the ACLU doing to protect the vote here in Virginia?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny, and thanks everyone for tuning in and learning about and asking great questions about the voting process here. So I guess the key thing that we're doing right now, we've had voting rights is one of the key priority areas of the ACLU of Virginia, and we've been kind of long-term advocating for actually passing a state constitutional amendment that would guarantee a right to vote that can't be taken away. In the short term during the pandemic, and all of the risks of transmission of in-person voting, we've been pushing for an expansion of some of the reforms that have already been passed in this most recent legislative session that have kind of expanded the use of absentee voting in Virginia, and to make it, make sure that all of these new reforms are being implemented well, and we're making sure that everyone can cast a ballot safely and ideally by mail. So as Jenny mentioned, we've advocated for a number of different things, and one of those is eliminating the requirement under Virginia law that voters have a witness sign their absentee ballot envelope. We had heard from some people that they were social distancing, that they lived alone, that they didn't want to risk going out to their neighbors' homes. Some of them said that they thought their neighbors were having symptoms. They didn't, and they had been following the governor's guidelines and the public health officials' guidelines, and didn't want to find someone else to actually vote absentee through this signature requirement. And unfortunately, there weren't really any guidelines or provisions under state law that allowed them to get around it. And in fact, their ballot, if they returned it without a signature, would be rejected. So, I think we sent a few different letters. One letter we sent to the governor that included this, as well as several other reforms that we thought should be taken. So I think it included eliminating the witness requirement, encouraging local electoral boards to greatly expand the number of locations where absentee ballots can be returned, to allow, there's actually a provision in Virginia law that allows for people who fall ill in the day of or the day preceding, just the very the immediate days around an election, for them to vote a special kind of emergency absentee ballot. So potentially to expand or at least better inform the public about that option for people who are ill, and potentially expand it to people who might have concerns related to COVID-19, because that option actually allows you to use designated representatives to drop off your ballot, and so you wouldn't have to go out on your own. You could have someone do that for you, and also, as I think Bobby and Jenny mentioned earlier, that this idea of being able to cure your ballot. So if you do send something back and it's missing something, whether it's the witness signature or something else, that registrars reach back out to you and say, hey, under our statutes and our guidance, we can't count this because we don't have enough information, or you're missing something, and then providing an opportunity to cure it, including finding a way to verify the voter through other means. Making sure that ultimately at the end of the day, what they're trying to do is just make sure that the voter actually voted. And as long as you can do that, don't reject the ballot because of an error that in this case might be the result of safety concerns. So we then sent a follow-up letter specifically about the witness requirement, and when we weren't able to get a resolution on that, we did file a lawsuit in federal court asking that it be, that basically saying that it was unconstitutional, that it violated the Voting Rights Act, and asking for it to be enjoined or blocked for upcoming elections, as long as these kinds of public health guidelines about social distancing are in effect. We then filed a motion for preliminary injunction, basically asking the court to, on a kind of emergency or contemporary basis, block the law at least for the June primary, which is on June 23rd. And I wish I had something more final to report. This is very fast moving, but yeah, we did reach an agreement with the state kind of after we filed the motion, and the state has they've agreed to not enforce the witness requirement for June, for the June 23rd primary. We haven't reached any agreement for any elections beyond that. And so basically what that would mean is that for anyone who doesn't feel like they can safely complete the witness requirement, they would be permitted to not comply with it, and their ballots would still be counted if it was returned. Now, there's a big caveat to that, which is that is not final yet. We have reached an agreement with the state, but we need to submit this consent decree to the court. And a lot of things happened in quick succession, and so there's probably going to be a hearing early next week where some of these issues might be fleshed out. So I think we'll have some more information to report about how final this is. At early next week, I'm hoping, but I think once something is final, I'm sure that the state will issue another news release about it. We certainly will, and we'll try to take effort to let everyone know about exactly what the agreement is, what elections it applies for, and everything else. Our agreement only applied to, I see that someone asked a question about it's about July.
Local election in Arlington in July. Yeah,
so our agreement specifically applies to the June 23rd election. It does not apply to the May election. Now we hope that the state will lift that requirement for May as well, but that wasn't, for a variety of reasons, that's not what the preliminary injunction asked for, and that's not what we agreed to as part of this consent decree. The litigation, even if this consent decree is ordered and entered by the court, it's going to continue because we think that that doesn't resolve the entire issue. This is just kind of a temporary agreement that applies to one election. We want to keep, and we hope that the state will kind of take this agreement and do the right thing for future elections, as long as this remains an issue. And certainly the July special election is so soon in time after June election that all the same, anticipate that all the same concerns will still be there. I can't imagine that these concerns are all going to be gone in the fall either. And so we very much are going to keep the litigation alive and keep pushing forward and trying to get the same type of rules in place, whether through the court order or through agreement, or through the state acting on its own. But that's where we are with the litigation.
I think that's something we do get asked a little bit. Is what is the rationale for why the state would not just do this? And I know that seeing the situation that we're in with CDC guidelines very clearly saying we need to be distancing from one another. What is the rationale for keeping this along? I don't know if Vishal, I think you probably have your own opinion on this. And a little bit of it is probably opinion and a little bit of it may be fact, but if you want to talk about
that. Honestly, I think if the state were on the call, they'd be the better ones to ask about this. I don't think that there is a good rationale for keeping it in place. It doesn't really do much. We make this point in our filings. There are a number of other methods the idea behind anything like a witness requirement is to make sure that the person who voted is who they say they are. But there are a number of other ways that we can do that, and including that they're signing under penalty of perjury, they're affirming their own signature, so they can do, and there's no other kind of verification of who this witness is. So this kind of fraud is A, extremely rare, but B, if someone were to go through the steps of actually signing their own name fraudulently, then surely it's not a great additional step to sign someone else's name as well. So that, you know, and there are laws against this. There are criminal penalties involved. There's and there are other verification steps that the state takes that have nothing to do with having someone else or having to leave your home to find someone else and get their name on your ballot.
I did want to address something in the comment for just in the chat box for a second. The prepaid ballot law will not go into effect until 2021. Trying to look that up. I was pretty sure it was going into effect July 1, 2020, but I will look into that and to see when that goes into effect. That was one of the recommendations that we asked the governor about, pushing into effect earlier, just to make this an easier process for people. Well, appreciate you going and talking about the lawsuit and kind of where we're at with that, and kind of, you know, it's in this weird state right now where it's kind of a partial victory, but not really there yet, and we'll just kind of wait and hear a little bit more about that. Someone did ask, are we going to go back and ask July or some of these other elections that impact everyone, but do impact quite a few people in some different localities. I don't know if you want to comment on that, or just sort of, you know, the point here, and that I would add, is that the state has the ability to waive this requirement. The Commissioner of Elections, I believe, has the ability, and correct me if I'm wrong, Vishal, to waive the requirement. Could issue this guidance tomorrow if we wanted to. So I think that's something certainly to put some pressure on and continue talking or pushing to do this, because, you know, we're filing a lawsuit to fix this, but this is something that could be pretty quickly fixed. So I think, do you have anything else to add to that point, Vishal, before we go into a larger? Vishal will be here for questions at the end too as well.
No, yeah, that's right. I mean, I can't speak about everything that we're going to do in the lawsuit at this point, but there's a lot of moving things, balls in the air, I guess. And then, but we hope the state will kind of take these kinds of steps to fix this issue for all elections going forward.
Great. Okay, well, I'm gonna go back to sharing my screen for just a second, and then so we can kind of talk about just everybody on the same page about how to vote absentee in Virginia, the different ways you can apply for a ballot, and then some important key dates that have kind of been changing quite a bit based on what's been happening with the reconvened session and the governor's with some amendments to change some things. So we'll go through those, how to vote absentee, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. We've been kind of answering them sporadically throughout, but there have been some questions that have been put in the Q&A box as well so bear with me while I share my screen one more time, and we'll talk through how to vote absentee in Virginia. So hopefully you can see my screen. Great. So applying for your ballot here in Virginia right now with the laws that we have. So there are 3 ways primarily to apply to vote absentee by mail. You have access to the internet and you have a Virginia driver's license or a DMV issued ID already, would be to just go online, go to vote.elections.virginia.gov, and it'll kind of walk you through this, but you're entering your first and last name, birth date, the last word of your social, where you live, or your locality of residence. And then checking the box that says applying to vote absentee, following the prompts, and then you should receive an absentee ballot in the mail. So that's probably the easiest way to do it. If you have access to a computer, to internet, and you have the state issued ID already. Sorry, there were some points there. If you're applying for your ballot and you don't have access to some of those things, we wanted to walk through a couple other methods that you can use. So you can always call your local registrar's office, and they will send you an absentee ballot application in the mail that you can fill out and send back. So you can find that number by going to vote.elections.virginia.gov, and then this is going to be some long stuff, but /voter information /public contact lookup. That gives you the contact information for your local registrar And it gives you the address, the mailing address, the phone number, everything. The other method you can use, if you have access to a printer, is to download and print, I guess, and the internet. You can download and print your own application at home, fill it in, sign it, and mail it to your local registrar's office, or you can email a scanned copy. So those are the 3 ways that you can apply at this point in Virginia. When you're going about returning your ballot, you want to make sure that you're filling out the ballot accurately and completely. If you can't meet the witness requirement due to social distancing, you should consult your local registrar or the Department of Elections, call them, let them know what's happening. There may be a fix in time for upcoming elections. That's something that we're working on. But obviously hearing from more people that this is an issue is always going to put pressure on those elected officials to change this. Ballots must be postmarked by election day. So we've listed those there, and they're also going to be in some important key dates that we'll go through. May 19th is the date of the local May election. This election impacts probably about close to 900,000 people in Virginia that will have a local election in May. 75% of the election, of the people that are voting in that election, are actually only in 9 localities. There's some of the bigger ones in Chesapeake, Norfolk, Newport News. So there's some larger areas there, but there's also just lots of local elections spread out across towns across Virginia. But they should be postmarked the 19th for the local elections for May, June 23rd for the June primary, and then November 3rd for the general election to be counted. You can drop off your ballot to your local registrar by 7 p.m. on election day, or you can mail it in as long as it's postmarked by election day. One stamp should do it to get this ballot returned. The address of your local registrar is located, actually comes with your ballot and the instructions. You can also use the website that was on the last slide there that we referenced. And by the way, this information should be recorded, and we have some of the access on our website if you want to get that there. That should have all the instructions to be able to do this as well. We wanted to cover May local elections. We talked about that a little bit. And we realize there are other elections and some other special elections in July and some other months. But to give you just sort of a snapshot of what's happened at this point with May, the governor initially said that, and this is still true, that you would be able to use COVID-19 as a valid excuse for voting absentee by mail or absentee in person for the May local elections. We actually did expedite the no excuse based voting system, so that's no longer a huge issue for upcoming elections. We were going to move to that anyway after July, but that was the initial step, was to try to ease some of the restrictions on people being able to vote absentee by mail. Then in the normal reconvened session on April 22nd, the Senate decided that it was not going to support a suggestion that the governor had to move the May elections to November. And that was for a variety of reasons that it probably won't go into here, but there were some serious concerns with it being moved. And so they voted that suggestion down, and the governor used his executive authority to do what he was able to do, which is to move the May election 2 weeks into the future, which is what he did with June. So that's where we're at now with the May local elections, that they will be held on the 19th. That is going to affect some of the deadlines that were associated with the May local election. So we're going to go through those, and then we'll have some time to do some questions. So 45 days out from any election, absentee voting begins in Virginia. You can request an absentee ballot 12 months before an election. So it's very possible that many people have already requested absentee ballots and are already going to get them for these elections. But if you haven't done so, the deadline to request to apply to vote an absentee ballot by mail for the May local election is May 12th. And that application request has to be received by 5 p.m. on that day. May 16th is the deadline to apply to vote absentee in person for the May local elections, which is still open. And then May 19th is the election day for many towns and city elections. For a list of that, you can also go to vote.election.virginia.gov to see a list of your local elections for May. June 23rd is the June primary date to keep in mind. And then we have some other dates on here for the general election that's coming up in the distant future here. But October 13th, deadline to register to vote for the general election. October 27th is the deadline to request an absentee ballot via mail, also received by 5 p.m. For the general election. And then this year, November 3rd, 2020, we will have our presidential election, and the GA this past session voted to make Election Day a holiday. So that first Tuesday in November will be a legal holiday in Virginia from now on. So just something to keep in mind for that day. At this point, we'll go to the chat box and see if there are any questions. If you have any questions that you want to ask any of the panelists, feel free to ask those now and type those into the chat box so that we can respond. Sorry, someone corrected me. Ballots must be received by 7 p.m. on election day, not postmarked by 7 p.m. on election day. Great. So if anybody has questions at this point, well, go ahead and answer. I think there's one in the Q&A box. Can you talk about the prospects of the governor calling a special session of the General Assembly to eliminate the witness requirement and other needed reforms? Yeah, I can talk about that a little bit. It is possible to call a special session. The legislature can call a special session if they have, I think it's 2/3 support to do that, or the governor can call a special session for any reason. My understanding right now is that he's not super inclined to do that. So and I would imagine it's probably because, and this is just me speculating, but I imagine it is because he doesn't really probably want to deal with all of the legislation that might get presented at a special session. You can certainly limit the amount, the scope of what a special session would cover. So it could just relate to voting, but you might see a lot of different reforms that would get pushed, or a lot of different different pieces of legislation there. So it's hard to control maybe what would come up, but certainly if he did, we already have been working on some potential legislation to bring for a special session, if that were there, to do a lot of these reforms, to move up some of these effective clauses and to remove the witness requirement. We have a question: what progress is there for ranked choice voting to extend? What policies get absorbed by the winning candidate and reduce name games? Bobby, do you know much about ranked choice voting? I know we had a bill here in Virginia this year about it. It was to run a pilot program, I believe, for ranked choice voting. But do you know anything about that more, from a more national perspective?
Yeah, I mean, we participated a bit in the campaign in Maine that is referenced there. So it'll be in place in Maine for the upcoming federal races in the state. I think it will require a state constitutional amendment to be in place in Maine for non-federal races. We've seen progress on ranked choice voting mostly occur at the local level, and I believe most of the organizations that focus solely on ranked choice voting have been seeking out that progress. I know it exists in quite a few localities within Maryland, and they've been having quite a few different discussions of counties adopting ranked choice voting in California. But I think for the near future, these alternative voting methods, including ranked choice voting, are probably most likely to see success at the local level before, or through pilot programs like what you're seeing offered in the legislation in Virginia, before they are built up to full scale statewide elections like we saw in Maine, which I think more or less came about through a ballot initiative process.
Great. Another question, I'm going to direct this to Vishal. Can Northam issue executive orders to do special things? So I would imagine, could he issue an executive order to, lift this requirement, or to make something effective faster, like
that? So the witness requirement, the State Board of Elections, I believe could change it through regulation, that you don't need the governor to ask to issue an executive order on that. there is a law that says that that lays out the procedures for filling out an absentee ballot, including the witness signature. So it is a requirement, but it has an entire statement of things that are required that go onto the absentee ballot envelope. And some of those things are considered immaterial errors. So even if people don't comply with those things, the ballot still gets counted. It's only a state board of elections regulation that says that the lack of a witness signature will be considered a material error or omission such that the ballot isn't counted. And so that's something that the state board that is appointed by the governor could change. And so you wouldn't need any kind of specific action by the governor on that.
There's another question about any opportunities, or is there any thought to a lawsuit to do away with the state ID identifier? I don't know if you know anything about that, Vishal. For the person who asked this, that might be about just having a state ID identifier. I'm not 100% sure.
I'm not sure.
We don't have a lawsuit scheduled to do that.
We certainly don't have a. We certainly do
not have a lawsuit. Bobby, do you know anything about state ID identifiers or any issues with that nationally or anything? Can anyone explain the impact of the new laws on requesting and returning absentee ballots that are effective July 1? I know they're there, and we have done a little bit of research about what new laws are going to go into effect and how they'll impact your ability to vote. There's so many different laws that are going to go into effect in July 1 that we actually decided to do our next voting webinar, which is going to be, I believe, on May 13th, on this topic specifically. I can say that it will loosen and some of the restrictions on who can drop off a ballot. I believe right now, I don't want to speak out of turn, but there's restrictions on who what third party can and for what reasons a third party can drop off an absentee ballot. I'll look up what bill that is. But I would imagine, so that folks can read it or can understand it a little bit better, but I would imagine the impact is going to be that you'll have greater ability for a family member or a friend to drop off a ballot for you. I don't know if there's a loosening on requesting an absentee ballot, other than the biggest one, which would be that we're moving from an excuse-based system to a non-excuse-based system. So right now there are 17 reasons why, I believe because the reconvened session, they actually did make this effective. We used to have 17 reasons why you had to vote out. You could vote absentee, and they were really bizarre, but they ranged from being out of your precinct for 11 hours or more on the day of the election to sitting in jail on a misdemeanor charge and being unable to get to the polling precinct because of that reason. So we eliminated those, and I would say that's the biggest impact for elections now, is that you can vote absentee for any reason whatsoever. So you can request an absentee ballot for any reason. You don't need an excuse anymore. Vishal, I'm going to toss this one to you. Can you vote if you have a voter registration ID card but not a Virginia driver's license?
A voter registration card but not a driver's license?
Yeah.
Well, in this recent legislative session, they repealed the stricter form of the voter ID law, so that it expanded the kinds of ID that you need to vote, and so it's not just a driver's license, and I forget all of the IDs that were in the small list, but now they've expanded that. So Jenny, do you remember?
I do actually know
when it goes into effect, because this also applies to the postmark deadline, because it used to be that the absentee ballot had to be returned by election day, but SB 4455, I think, changed that to it's a postmark deadline. Then that wouldn't have gone into effect until November, but maybe that was moved up recently by the governor.
Well, I will say because, and you can see us sort of, going back and forth on some of this stuff, there's, 20 some odd different laws that I think have gone into, it was a big year for voting reform, and I in Virginia. So we're going to do a whole webinar on the impact of these laws. So I think for now, we might pause on that. Please join us for that. For that webinar. We'll send that back out to all of our members so folks can join in on that and get a better idea. The voter ID restriction loosening, I do believe, is going into effect this year, and it basically opens back up voter utility statements, your registration ID card, and no longer having to use a photo ID to vote. This question, again, probably is going to go to Vishal. Has the Attorney General given an opinion on using electronic signatures for petitions to qualify for local ballots? I know we had been reached out to a little bit about this issue with candidates qualifying for the ballot. And Bobby, I don't know if you've seen this issue actually nationally, that candidates are having a really hard time collecting ballot signatures. So actually, maybe if you have anything to add on that nationally, because I know we haven't been doing a ton of work here on it, but do know it's an issue.
Yeah, I can talk about it from a national perspective, and I think where we've been really seeing the brunt of this hit is also on work for ballot initiatives in states where citizens are allowed to collect petition signatures in order to make changes to their state constitution or for citizen-initiated statutes in states. Obviously, because of COVID, individuals have not been able to go out and collect signatures at a rate that they were able to do so before for either these ballot initiatives, nor for a lot of these candidate races. The way that this has been kind of addressed in many states is they've been providing for reductions in amount of signatures needed, or allowing some sort of electronic petition signature to be provided either through a system like DocuSign, or in the case of Arizona, where we're currently working on a ballot initiative campaign, we're seeking out as relief the ability for individuals to submit signatures through a system called eQual, which is the verification system that candidates are allowed to use in order to collect petition signatures. The way that works is individuals can provide their voter ID number or their driver's license number, and it ports in their signature that is being maintained at the driver's license bureau within the state. So I think that's a potential option for many states as well, and that's how generally online voter registration works in many states. Is that if you have a signature on file with the DMV from getting a driver's license or a state identification card, they can port in your signature through that method. But yeah, I think it's an issue that state by state we're seeing relief be provided in a variety of different ways, but it's obviously a concern and difficulty for candidates and ballot initiative campaigns throughout the country.
Yeah, Vishal, I don't know if you know this, but has there been anything happening? I know we've had issues in Virginia, but I don't know that there's any.
I'm not aware of any guidance that the state has issued on this. I know that some people have been wondering about how they're going to comply, whether there's going to be new guidance. As far as I'm aware, last I had heard, there has been no guidance about or any changes to the petition signature rules.
Yeah. There was a clarification on one question, and it was about that state identifier. This is about having to have a DMV issued ID in order to use the online ballot application system for applying to vote absentee by mail. So that's something that actually came to us through a partner having some difficulty applying online to get an absentee ballot, and where they were prompted to print this out and sign it and send it back. So we're still looking into that as an issue. What we think is happening is, it's not so much the state identifier as being a problem, it's the need to have a signature on file with the state. So if you don't have a state issued ID, you don't have a signature on file. So that's the problem that we're kind of looking into to see what the issue is. It doesn't seem to be a code in Virginia that requires that. It may just be potentially something that the DMV or the State Board of Elections, maybe something that the State Board of Elections is requiring. So we are looking into that, but don't have much else to report on that yet. No lawsuit on any plans to handle that, since there are a variety of other means people can take to apply for an absentee ballot via mail. I think that was it. There was one other question about any work being done to increase access to voter registration in Virginia. We typically are not working as much with voter registration as much as access to voting itself. If you're registered, and we obviously want to see felony disenfranchisement not be a thing in Virginia, and are still very much pressing forward with that campaign to have a constitutional amendment to guarantee the right to vote for all. So I think that probably applies a little bit there to increase access to actually being able to register to vote. But I don't think we're doing anything outside of that as a more statewide approach to increasing access. I think that's all the questions for right now. We're coming up right at noon. So I appreciate everyone and participating in this. Thank you to the panelists. Yes, of course, the League of Women Voters is always working on voter registration efforts, and people should definitely go there and check out the great work that they're doing. But thanks to everybody for being part of this today. Hopefully this was helpful, and you walked away knowing how to participate in the system a little bit better and share some information with everybody about how to do this. So thank you, everybody.